So a few of you guys might remember that back at NAB this year, 7Artisans were teasing these lenses. They are a full Cine set, a 35, a 50, and a 75 for less than $1,000 total. Cine lenses with gears and a 300-degree focus pull, and by the way, they open up all the way to a T1.5. These are the Dream Cine lenses. 7Artisans didn't send me these lenses. They aren't sponsoring this video. I decided to buy these lenses with my own money. They're not perfect, but they're really interesting. I'll just give the video away right now. If you want a clinically sharp G Master lens, these guys are about as far from that as you could possibly get. But they have some really unique character and they're not a bad price for what you get. I did a bunch of testing with these lenses, so I want to go over that stuff with you guys. I feel like nobody watches these reviews for the 10-minute montage of slow motion shots that you can get on pretty much any camera and any set of lenses. So I'm going to spare you that. But if you're interested, I'll leave a link below where you can download the raw footage from this and have a look at it yourself, and you can zoom it in and pixel peep as much as you want. The first thing we should go over is kind of what these lenses are. And I'll pop a spec sheet over here in the corner just so you can read through them if you're interested in the specs. They're all very similarly built. They're very heavy. So if you're coming from like more plastic, like my Tamron lenses, these were shockingly heavy. If you're used to Cine glass, these are actually kind of on the light side. They're very similar to the DZO Arcanas, if you're used to shooting with those or if you've seen reviews on those. They all have very close minimum focus distances, which is about 2.5 feet. These things are all full frame lenses, which is fantastic for the price point. The one difference is that might be an issue is that they're not actually all built the same. The 35mm has 10 elements in 9 groups and 11 blades on their aperture. The 50mm is kind of the in-between one. It has 9 elements in 7 groups and it has a 10 bladed aperture. The 75mm is actually the simplest one in the group. It only has 6 elements in 6 groups and it has a 13 bladed iris. Those are some of the differences just to be aware of if you're picking these up and you want them to match perfectly. I found when I was shooting in normal situations that switching between lenses felt pretty natural, and if I had to adjust anything, it was minimal. But if you need things to be exactly the same throughout your set, just be aware of that. They all have matching aperture rings and focus rings, and they're all marked in both meters on one side and feet on the other side. On the operator side, it's marked in meters, which I have to kind of look on the dumb side of the camera for feet. Not a big deal, but if you're used to operating on the left-hand side of the camera, you will have meters marked here and you'll have to look on the right side of the camera for feet. The rings are also equally distant on all of them. So if you've got a follow focus, they'll match on all of these. All of the lenses also have an 82mm filter thread. So if you're using screw-on filters and you're not using a matte box, you can use the same screw-on filter for all 3 of these in the set. For me, the focus ring on all 3 of these is well dampened and it feels like it's got a good amount of resistance. And I was hoping that the aperture ring might have just a little bit more resistance just to help you lock in whatever aperture you're at. When I was shooting, I would find myself reaching for the aperture ring on accident. So I wish the aperture ring had just a little bit more resistance in it, but they both have really good resistance and the resistance feels matched throughout the set. So one doesn't feel lighter than the other. Let's go over corner sharpness and just overall sharpness of these lenses. I did 2 different tests to really put these lenses through their paces. One was just a sharpness chart with a color chart. You can see these here and we'll go over them in just a second. I also shot a brick wall straight on. Kind of a silly test, but it helps you see, because the patterns are all the same, helps you see the sharpness in the corners versus in the center of the frame, and it also gives you a good sense of if there's any distortion on the lenses. When I was shooting the color charts, one thing to be aware of is because all of these lenses focus at about 2.5 feet, the 35mm, it was hard to test what the corner sharpness actually was because I couldn't actually get the test chart to fill the entire frame. In general, these are budget lenses, so at T1.5, they will be a little bit soft. I noticed that the 35 was probably the worst, which was interesting because it has the most elements in the most groups, but those elements seem to be making this lens softer and have a little bit more haloing, especially all the way open at T1.5, that I didn't see as much on the 50 and the 75. To me, the 50mm was the absolute sharpest all the way open at T1.5, and the 35 was the worst. 75 was kind of sitting in the middle of those two. When you stop down to T2.8, all of the lenses look very good and are definitely usable, with some noticeable softness still in the corners. If you want really sharp corners, stopping down to like T4 really fixes this throughout the lens set. I noticed in my real world testing, T1.5 felt soft all the time, and it was kind of tough to pull focus. Your depth of field is so razor thin that if your camera's moving and your subject is moving, it's a tough job pulling focus. And then also, because of those extra elements in the 35, even made focus tools like focus peaking difficult and hard to dial in because there was so much haloing, it wasn't creating enough contrast. I tried as best I could to shoot a lot of this stuff at T1.5 just to see and test how it was. But if you're using these out real world, especially if you're hand holding, T2.8 is a lot safer. Next, let's talk about focus breathing and focus behavior, because that was an interesting thing that I noticed with these lenses. Obviously, these are budget lenses, so the manufacturing are not going to be quite at the same level of an Ingenue or a Cooke. Don't expect that. You're paying $300 for each of these lenses. I noticed the worst focus breathing on the 75mm, and it kind of makes sense because this is the most simple design. It only has 6 elements in 6 groups, so the elements need to move back and forth a little bit more to focus your image. But also it's the longest focal range, and that will inherently have more focus breathing than a wider lens. The 35 had the least amount of focus breathing. Obviously, it's a wider lens, but you're dealing with some of that softness that you don't have in the 75. So it's kind of a trade-off. The 50mm was the middle for the focus breathing as well. Another pro and con of all 3 of these lenses is they share the same 300-degree focus ring. I found myself when I was just hunting for that focus and making sure it was dialed in perfectly, having 300 degrees meant it felt very exact every time I was trying to dial in focus. On the flip side of that, if you don't have a follow focus and you're trying to pull by hand on all of these lenses, you will find that going from minimum focus all the way out to infinity requires some really impressive yoga or like multiple steering wheel turns to get all the way through the focus range. On a second shoot day, I put these lenses on my gimbal and used the follow focus. That made pulling focus on this so much easier. So if you have an electronic follow focus like the Tilt-A-Nucleus, you are going to really enjoy pulling on these. The last thing about focusing that I noticed on all 3 of these lenses is they have a slight amount of focus shift when you're changing your aperture. What that means is the focus marking on the side of the lens changes slightly as you stop down the lens. What I noticed is it was a couple of tenths of a meter if I went from a T2.8 to a T4 on this 35mm, which means your focus isn't exactly the same. This is kind of a common problem with cheaper budget-friendly lenses, so the Dream lenses are not alone in that issue, but just be aware, stopping down the lens may change that focus just slightly. I noticed it was worse on the 35. The 50 and the 75, maybe because they have fewer elements, have less focus shifting when you're changing apertures, so you get less focus shifting on the 2 tighter lenses than you do on the 35, but just be aware of that you will experience some focus shifting if you're switching apertures mid-shoot. Moving on to vignetting and distortions, if you want perfectly sharp clinical lenses, you're not going to be happy with these. These lenses have some unique character when you're shooting with them. Part of that is going to be some distortion and vignetting. I noticed vignetting on all 3 lenses at T1.5. It does clean up significantly at T2.8. The other thing I thought was strange when I was testing these lenses, and you can tell me if you see the same thing in the comments, but I noticed that the 50mm seemed to have significantly more barrel distortion than I would expect at a 50mm focal range. Usually those are fairly straight lines, but if you look at my focus test chart, it seems to have some barreling around the sides, and when I shot against that brick wall, I noticed the same thing. There was fairly significant distortions on the side of the lens, which seemed odd for a 50mm. Obviously, there's some distortion on the 35mm because it's a wider lens, and the 75mm basically resolves lines perfectly straight. So let me know if you see the same thing that I'm seeing with the 50mm. In normal shooting situations, I didn't really notice it. It only came down to when I was shooting these very specific tests, and especially when you get to close or minimum focus distance. That seemed to be where the lines bowed the most. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Moving on to one of the most important sections, and probably the weakest characteristics of all 3 of these lenses, is chromatic aberration. They've done a better job here for sure than my old Rokinon set, but there's still significant longitudinal chromatic aberration, or Bokeh, in all of these lenses throughout all the tests that I shot. It is also noticeable in your normal shooting scenarios, especially when you're shooting in high contrast. This shot shooting the trees against the sky, you can definitely see some green and magenta fringing. If you are absolutely allergic to chromatic aberration, you may find yourself frustrated with these lenses. Stopping down to a 4 removes it almost altogether, unless you're on this guy. The 35 still has chromatic aberration on pretty much any f-stop. We can zoom in and I can show you exactly how shifting from near to far shows significant green and magenta fringing. Everything here was shot on the Nikon ZR at 6K, R3D 12-bit on the stock IPP2 color space. When I pulled them into DaVinci Resolve, I added a Rec. 709 conversion so we could see a little bit more of that contrast, but everything else is pretty much stock. And if you want this footage to pixel peep on your own, the link is down in the description below. Comparing the set against each other, the 50mm is probably the best at controlling the chromatic aberration, and stopping down really helps clean that up. The 75mm has violent shifts between green and magenta, but it resolves very nicely if you nail your focus. The 35mm is softer with significant haloing, so it makes the chromatic aberration slightly softer than it is in the 75mm, but it really doesn't resolve itself as much, and it is noticeable all the way through the aperture range. The other thing to note here is if you're all the way open at a t1.5, even when you're spot on focus, you'll still notice chromatic aberrations, even in the center. If you go out to the edges, all the way through almost f4, you'll notice chromatic aberrations. It's a little bit stronger and more pronounced in the corners than it is in the center, so just be aware of that, but that's par for the course with budget lenses. When shooting on cinema lenses, especially ones like these that open all the way up to a t1.5, you're buying these lenses for the bokeh. And these lenses don't disappoint. They render bokeh really, really nicely. The interesting thing to be aware of, though, is you're jumping between different sized aperture blades. From 11, the 75 has 13, and then the 50 has 10, so they will alter in shape a little bit. The 35 looked a little bit noisy to me in real world testing. That's just my eye, and you guys can take a look at some of these shots as well with the 35, and that might be because I was shooting against a lot of trees. The 75 was obviously beautiful. The 50 was one of my favorite lenses to shoot with in this set. In terms of bokeh balls at night, here's a great test of what they look like shot against a couple of cafe lights. One issue with all three of these lenses is you're going to get some cat's eye in all three of the lenses all the way open at t1.5. You'll notice that especially out here at the corners, but honestly, even in the centers, I noticed that the bokeh balls weren't perfectly round. As you stop down, they do round out a lot more and the cat's eye goes away. But as you stop down, now you have polygonal bokeh balls instead of that perfectly round. So you'll never find a perfectly round bokeh ball in any of these three. To me, the 75 had the best rendition of the bokeh in the background. Oddly enough, this was the one with the fewest amount of elements and the fewest amount of groups. The 50mm had a unique problem that I didn't notice on the 75 or the 35. Take a look at this shot right here and you can clearly see, even as I stop down, you get onion ringing. The only thing that's a little bit difficult for me is those characteristics don't carry over throughout the set. So you get slightly different characteristics with the 35 than you do with the 50 and you do with the 75. The 50mm had the most aggressive onion ringing out of the three, and the 70 had the cleanest bokeh all the way through the range. You can also notice that chromatic aberration as I shift from near focus to far focus on these bokeh balls. Now, one of my favorite characteristics of all three of these lenses is actually how they flare. If you like super controlled, clinical, no flares ever, then you probably won't love these lenses. But if your style of shooting capitalizes on sun flares and light hits these front elements, then all three of these are going to give you very natural looking flares. That was one of my favorite parts about these lenses, and you can see this test when I was hitting them with a flashlight. I even noticed these flares when I was out shooting normally and really liked how natural and creamy the flares looked. They didn't look super digital or super sharp. Some of the newer lenses that I've been seeing out there have very streaky or very hard flares. That is just not personally my taste or my style. Now, if you want to control those, a matte box or a lens hood on these will help control your lens flaring. So you don't have to have the lens flare, but you will need a matte box or some kind of lens hood to control the light coming into that front element. At an 88mm opening, there's a lot of glass on the front of these lenses, and you will get flaring if you don't protect that front element. Now, to me, that's one of my favorite features of these lenses, and they add a lot of characteristic to my shooting, and it made shooting with these lenses really fun. If you don't like flares, keep that in mind. This probably won't be your favorite set of lenses. So who are these lenses for, and should you actually pick this set of lenses up? First of all, if I had to pick just one of these lenses to buy, it would probably be the 50mm. It is the sharpest, all the way open at t1.5. It resolves the best at t2.8. It's the easiest to use, and outside of those onion rings in the bokeh test, it really had some of the best imaging out of the set. I'm a little disappointed that at least my copy of the 35 was so soft, all the way open at t1.5, because 35mm is definitely my favorite focal length. If you could only pick one, go with the 50mm first, and then add to the set. But realistically, these things are priced to be able to pick up the whole set under $1,000. That is honestly one of the biggest advantages of this set. So if you like vintage lenses, or if you enjoy shooting on lenses that have a little bit more unique character, you're gonna love these lenses as much as I do. I think 7Artisans really nailed a unique set of cinema lenses here. They were able to get an entire set for under $1,000, which is insane in itself. You can get some really beautiful imagery with these lenses if you know what you're doing and you know how to kind of work around some of the limitations of these lenses. Especially if you can work around the chromatic aberration. That seemed to be the weakest point in my testing. If you can work around that, these lenses really resolve beautifully. If you made it this far in the video, thank you, I appreciate it. And I'm so interested in knowing what you think in the comments down below. Let me know what you think about these lenses. Have they been on your radar like they've been on mine? And if this review helped at all, helped you make a decision, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next video or the next live stream that we do. Until the next one, guys, keep creating. Peace.